My name is David Martinez, and at 53 years old, I learned that love can cost you everything you think you know about friendship, community, and belonging. This is the story of how I went from being a respected elder in my Jehovah's Witness congregation to a completely isolated man who lost every friend he had ever made, all because I chose to marry the woman who saved my life. I need to start 3 years earlier, when my world first collapsed. It was a Tuesday evening in April when I lost my wife Sarah. She had been driving home from our midweek meeting, the same route she had taken hundreds of times over our 28 years of marriage. A drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into her car at 60 miles per hour. Sarah was killed instantly. The funeral was everything you'd expect from Jehovah's Witnesses: respectful, hopeful, focused on the resurrection promise. Brother Thompson gave a beautiful talk about how Sarah was merely sleeping in death, waiting for Jehovah to wake her up in the new system. The congregation rallied around me with meals, offers to help with household tasks, and constant reminders that this was just a temporary separation. But for me, it felt permanent and devastating. Sarah and I had been married since we were both 25. We had converted to the witness faith together during our second year of marriage, drawn by the promise of eternal life and the tight-knit community we found at the Kingdom Hall. We built our entire existence around the organization's schedule and expectations. 3 meetings per week, field service every Saturday morning, circuit assemblies, district conventions, and a social circle that consisted entirely of other witnesses. I had been serving as an elder for 15 years by the time Sarah died. It was a position I took seriously, shepherding calls with struggling publishers, handling judicial committee meetings for serious wrongdoing, giving talks from the platform, and representing the congregation at various organizational functions. Sarah pioneered for 12 years, spending 70 hours each month in door-to-door preaching work. Our life had structure, purpose, and meaning within the framework of what we believed was God's only true organization on earth. We never had children. We told ourselves it was Jehovah's will, though privately we both struggled with infertility issues that we never fully addressed. Instead, we poured our parental energy into the younger members of the congregation, hosting gatherings for the single brothers and sisters, providing guidance to newly interested ones, and generally being the kind of stable, mature couple that others looked up to. When Sarah died, I didn't just lose my wife. I lost my partner in everything that had given our lives meaning. Suddenly, I was attending meetings alone, going out in field service without my usual partner, and coming home to an empty house that echoed with memories of shared meals, Bible study sessions, and quiet conversations about congregation matters. The grief was overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had given countless talks about how death was just sleep, how the resurrection hope should comfort us in our darkest moments, how Jehovah would provide the strength we needed to endure any trial. But facing the reality of losing the person who had been my closest companion for nearly 3 decades, those comforting words felt hollow and inadequate. I continued fulfilling my elder responsibilities because I didn't know what else to do. I gave talks, conducted book studies, and participated in shepherding calls, all while feeling like I was dying inside. The brothers were sympathetic but expected me to return to normal functioning relatively quickly. After all, we had the truth. We knew death was temporary, we understood Jehovah's purposes, we had the hope of seeing our loved ones again in paradise. But I wasn't finding comfort in these teachings the way I was supposed to. Instead, I was plagued by questions I had never allowed myself to ask before. If this was really Jehovah's loving arrangement, why did it hurt so much? If the resurrection was so certain, why did I feel so hopeless? If the organization really provided the best way of life, why was I so miserable following it? These doubts terrified me. I had been taught that questioning the organization's teachings was the beginning of apostasy, that allowing doubts to take root would lead to spiritual shipwreck. So I buried my questions, increased my meeting attendance, and threw myself into congregation activities with even more dedication than before. If I was struggling spiritually, the solution was obviously more involvement in theocratic activities. But the emptiness persisted. It was 18 months after Sarah's death that Elena Rodriguez entered my life. I had been working as a project manager for Martinez Construction Company for nearly 20 years. It was a job that allowed me the flexibility to attend all the meetings and maintain my elder responsibilities while still providing well for Sarah and myself. The company had grown significantly over the years, and we had recently hired several new employees to handle our expanding client base. Elena was one of those new employees, brought in to manage our accounting department and streamline our financial operations. She was 45 years old, never married, and had spent most of her career working for larger corporations before deciding she wanted to be part of a smaller, more personal work environment. She was quiet, professional, and extraordinarily competent at her job. I noticed her efficiency first, the way she could analyze complex project budgets and identify potential problems before they became costly mistakes. Then I began to notice other things about her. She remembered everyone's birthdays and would leave small gifts or cards on their desks. She stayed late to help younger employees learn new software programs. She had a way of listening to people that made them feel heard and valued. Our first real conversation happened during a particularly stressful week when we were dealing with a major client crisis. 3 different projects were behind schedule, we had cost overruns on 2 others, and the client was threatening to terminate their contract with us. I was working 16-hour days trying to coordinate solutions, and I was exhausted both physically and emotionally. Elena knocked on my office door around 8 o'clock one evening and asked if I had eaten dinner. When I admitted I had been surviving on coffee and vending machine snacks for the past 3 days, she disappeared and returned 20 minutes later with a container of homemade soup and fresh bread from the Italian restaurant across the street. "You can't solve problems effectively if you're not taking care of yourself," she said matter-of-factly, setting the food on my desk. "This crisis will still be here after you eat something nutritious." It was a simple gesture, but it hit me with unexpected force. Sarah had always been the one who made sure I ate properly, got enough sleep, and didn't work myself into the ground. Since her death, no one had expressed that kind of personal concern for my well-being. The congregation members were supportive in spiritual matters, but they didn't notice or care whether I was eating regular meals or getting adequate rest. That night, Elena and I ended up talking until almost midnight about the project crisis, but also about life, work, and the challenges of managing people and deadlines. She was insightful, funny, and surprisingly easy to talk to. For the first time in 18 months, I felt like someone was seeing me as David the person, not Elder Martinez the spiritual leader who was supposed to have all the answers. Over the following weeks, our conversations became more frequent and personal. She told me about growing up in a large Catholic family where Sunday dinners were sacred, where her grandmother taught all the grandchildren to make traditional Mexican dishes, and where disagreements were loud but love was constant. I found myself sharing stories about my childhood, my relationship with Sarah, and even some of my struggles with grief and faith. Elena never tried to fix me or offer religious platitudes. She didn't tell me that everything happened for a reason or that I needed to trust in God's plan. Instead, she listened with genuine compassion and offered the kind of human comfort that I desperately needed. When I talked about missing Sarah, she acknowledged the depth of my loss without trying to minimize it. When I mentioned feeling lost and purposeless, she reminded me of all the ways I was making a positive impact on the people around me. I knew I was crossing dangerous territory. Jehovah's Witnesses are strongly counseled against forming close friendships with non-believers, especially romantic relationships. The organization teaches that such associations will inevitably weaken our faith and lead us away from the truth. I had given talks on this very subject, warning younger brothers about the spiritual dangers of worldly friendships. But I was so lonely, so desperate for authentic human connection, that I couldn't bring myself to end what was becoming the most meaningful relationship in my life. Our friendship gradually deepened into something more. Elena would bring me lunch when she noticed I was too busy to eat. I would drive her to work when her car was being repaired. We started taking walks together during our lunch breaks, talking about everything from current events to childhood memories to dreams for the future. She had a way of asking questions that made me think more deeply about my own beliefs and motivations. The first time she asked me about my religion, I gave her the standard presentation I had been trained to deliver. I explained that Jehovah's Witnesses were the only true Christians, that we followed Bible principles more closely than any other religion, and that we had been chosen by God to preach the good news in these last days before Armageddon. Elena listened politely but asked follow-up questions that I found difficult to answer. Why did God choose this particular organization when there had been sincere Christians for nearly 2,000 years before the Watchtower existed? If the Bible was really clear about God's requirements, why did there need to be so much interpretation and explanation from human leaders? If love was supposed to be the identifying mark of true Christians, why did the organization practice shunning that completely cut people off from their families? These weren't hostile questions. They came from genuine curiosity and a desire to understand my perspective. but they forced me to confront inconsistencies and problems I had always glossed over or accepted without serious examination. 6 months after we first started talking, Elena and I went to dinner together. It wasn't an official date. We both understood the complicated nature of my situation, but it felt like one. We talked for 3 hours about everything except work, laughing together in ways I hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. When Elena smiled at me across the table, I realized I was falling in love with her. The realization terrified me. I knew exactly what this meant for my standing in the congregation. I knew the scriptural warnings about being unevenly yoked with unbelievers. I knew the organizational policies about association with those outside the faith. I had counseled other brothers facing similar situations, always emphasizing the importance of spiritual priorities over emotional desires. But I also knew that Elena had brought me back to life in ways I hadn't thought possible. For the first time since Sarah's death, I felt hope for the future. I looked forward to waking up each morning because I knew I would see Elena's smile and hear her laugh. She had helped me remember who I was underneath all the titles and responsibilities. Just a man who wanted to love and be loved. I tried to convince myself that I could make it work within the framework of my faith. I began sharing our literature with Elena, explaining our basic beliefs, and eventually invited her to attend a meeting with me. She agreed, which surprised me, and sat through the entire 2-hour program with respectful attention. Afterward, she was polite but honest about her reaction. The rigid structure felt oppressive to her. The emphasis on obedience to organizational authority reminded her of controlling environments she had worked hard to escape in her professional life. The restrictions on personal freedom, what to wear, what to watch, who to associate with, seemed inconsistent with the kind of loving God she had grown up believing in. "I believe in God," she told me gently, "but I think my relationship with Him is personal. I don't understand why loving Him requires following so many specific rules about every aspect of daily life." She attended one more meeting with me, trying to be supportive of something that was obviously important to me. But I could see that it wasn't resonating with her spiritually, and I knew it never would. Elena was too independent, too thoughtful, too comfortable with ambiguity and personal responsibility to embrace the kind of structured submission that the organization required. According to everything I had been taught for 32 years, her response should have been a clear sign that this relationship was not blessed by Jehovah. I should have thanked her for her time, explained that I needed to focus on spiritual priorities, and ended our romantic involvement before it went any further. But I couldn't do it. Elena wasn't just someone I was attracted to. She was my closest friend, my confidant, the person who had helped me navigate the darkest period of my life. She had shown me more genuine Christian love through her actions than I had experienced from many people who claimed to be following Christ's example. Our relationship continued, but I became more careful about keeping it separate from my congregation activities. I didn't bring Elena to social gatherings with other witnesses. I didn't mention her during casual conversations with the brothers and sisters. When people asked about my social life, I deflected with vague comments about being busy with work and elder responsibilities. This secrecy felt dishonest and exhausting, but I wasn't ready to face the consequences of being open about our relationship. I needed time to figure out how to reconcile my love for Elena with my commitment to the organization that had shaped my entire adult life. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially in close-knit communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. The first sign of trouble came when Sister Rodriguez, one of the pioneers in our congregation, saw Elena and me having lunch together at a restaurant downtown. She approached our table with a friendly smile and introduced herself to Elena, but I could see the curiosity and concern in her eyes. After Elena excused herself to use the restroom, Sister Rodriguez asked pointed questions about our relationship and expressed worry about my spiritual well-being. I explained that Elena was a work colleague and that we occasionally discussed business matters over lunch. This was technically true, but it was also deliberately misleading, and I could tell that Sister Rodriguez wasn't entirely convinced. Word spread quickly through the congregation that Brother Martinez had been seen having intimate lunches with a worldly woman. Nothing was said directly to me, but I noticed changes in how people interacted with me. Conversations became more formal and less personal. Invitations to social gatherings became less frequent. When I gave talks from the platform, I felt like people were scrutinizing my words and demeanor for signs of spiritual weakness. The breaking point came when Elena and I decided to make our relationship official. We had been seeing each other for 14 months by that point, and both of us were tired of hiding our feelings. I was 52 years old, she was 46. We weren't teenagers who needed to sneak around behind our parents' backs. We were adults who had found love and wanted to build a life together. When I asked Elena to marry me, her face lit up with pure joy. She said yes immediately, throwing her arms around me and crying happy tears. For a moment, I forgot about all the complications and consequences. I was just a man who had found the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with, and she felt the same way about me. But reality set in quickly when we began making wedding plans. Elena wanted to share our engagement with her family, friends, and co-workers. She wanted to post photos on social media and celebrate this new chapter in our lives. She wanted to plan a wedding that reflected both of our personalities and honored both of our families' traditions. Her family was Catholic, and it was important to them that the ceremony take place in their parish church. Elena had been raised in that church, had been baptized there as an infant, and had celebrated every major milestone of her life within its walls. Her parents, who had been married in the same church 48 years earlier, were devastated at the thought of their daughter's wedding taking place anywhere else. I understood their perspective and wanted to be respectful of their traditions. Elena had been incredibly supportive of my faith throughout our relationship, never criticizing my beliefs or asking me to compromise my convictions. The least I could do was show the same respect for her family's religious heritage. But I also knew what this meant for my standing in the congregation. Jehovah's Witnesses are forbidden from participating in interfaith ceremonies or having their weddings in other churches. Such actions are viewed as compromise with false religion and can result in disfellowshipping or other serious consequences. When I announced our engagement to the congregation, the response was noticeably lukewarm. Where other engagements were met with enthusiasm, congratulations, and offers to help with wedding preparations, ours was greeted with polite but distant acknowledgement. No one liked our engagement photos on social media. No one asked about wedding details or venue selection. The silence was deafening. Instead, I began receiving requests for shepherding calls from fellow elders. These weren't social visits. They were formal meetings designed to address spiritual concerns about my relationship choices. Brother Thompson, who had been a close friend for over a decade, sat in my living room and reminded me about the scriptural warnings regarding being unevenly yoked with unbelievers. Brother Garcia, another longtime friend, suggested that I was making decisions based on loneliness and grief rather than spiritual wisdom. The pressure was subtle but constant. During elders' meetings, there were meaningful glances and carefully worded comments about maintaining proper standards in the congregation. Certain assignments and responsibilities were quietly transferred to other brothers. Nothing was said directly, but I could feel my standing in the congregation eroding week by week. The final confrontation came when Elena and I set our wedding date and confirmed that the ceremony would take place in her family's Catholic church. I knew I needed to inform the other elders about this decision, so I requested a meeting with the body of elders to discuss the situation openly. The meeting took place on a Thursday evening in the Kingdom Hall Library. 5 elders sat across from me around the small conference table. Men I had worked with for years, men who had supported me through Sarah's death, men I had considered close friends. The circuit overseer, Brother Williams, was visiting that week and joined the meeting to provide organizational guidance on my situation. The atmosphere was formal and cold, nothing like the warm discussions we had shared in the past about congregation matters and personal concerns. Brother Williams opened the meeting by reading several paragraphs from organizational publications about the importance of marrying only in the Lord and the dangers of compromise with false religious practices. They presented the scriptural and organizational reasons why I could not have my wedding in a Catholic church while maintaining my position as an elder. They explained that such an action would compromise the congregation's reputation in the community and confuse other brothers and sisters about proper Christian conduct. They emphasized that my choices would inevitably influence others and could lead to a relaxation of standards throughout the congregation. The ultimatum was delivered with businesslike efficiency: postpone the wedding until Elena became a baptized witness, or resign from my position as an elder and face possible disfellowshipping for participating in interfaith religious activities. I asked for time to consider their counsel, but I already knew what my decision would be. I had spent months trying to find a way to make both worlds coexist, but they were fundamentally incompatible. The organization demanded total loyalty, complete submission to its interpretation of Scripture, and absolute priority over all other relationships and commitments. There was no room for the kind of love I had found with Elena. Messy, complicated, human love that didn't fit neatly into organizational categories and couldn't be regulated by committee decisions. I resigned from my position as an elder the following week, submitting a brief letter that stated my intention to marry Elena and my understanding that this would require stepping down from my responsibilities. The announcement was made during the next service meeting. Brother David Martinez is no longer serving as an elder in this congregation. No explanation was provided to the congregation, but none was needed. Everyone knew about Elena, everyone knew about the Catholic wedding, and everyone understood what my choice represented. I had chosen personal happiness over spiritual responsibility, worldly love over organizational loyalty, human companionship over divine approval. The wedding took place on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in June, exactly 2.5 years after Sarah's death. Elena looked radiant in her grandmother's wedding dress, a gorgeous gown that had been carefully preserved for decades in anticipation of this day. Her family welcomed me with open arms, treating me like the son-in-law they had always hoped Elena would find. The ceremony was everything Elena had dreamed of, traditional Catholic rituals combined with personal touches that reflected our relationship and shared values. Father Miguel, who had known Elena's family for 20 years, gave a homily about love, commitment, and the importance of supporting each other through life's challenges. Elena's nieces served as flower girls, her brother walked her down the aisle, and her parents beamed with pride throughout the entire celebration. For a few hours, I forgot about everything I had lost and focused entirely on what I had gained. Elena was my wife. I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about our happiness, and I felt more peace and joy than I had experienced in years. But the reality of my situation became clear immediately after the wedding. The systematic shunning began the Monday morning following our ceremony. Phone calls went unanswered, text messages received no responses, and emails disappeared into electronic silence. Brothers and sisters who had been part of my daily life for decades simply stopped acknowledging my existence. The congregation elders had apparently decided that my marriage in a Catholic church constituted disassociation from the organization. While I hadn't been formally disfellowshipped through a judicial committee, the practical effect was identical. I was to be treated as someone who had abandoned the truth and chosen the world over Jehovah. The comprehensive nature of the shunning was more devastating than I had prepared for. These weren't just casual acquaintances or distant congregation members. They were people who had been my closest friends, my support system, my spiritual family for over 3 decades. Brother Thompson, who had been my closest friend in the organization, lived 3 blocks from my house. We had worked together on countless congregation projects, had shared meals at each other's homes hundreds of times, and had confided in each other about personal struggles and spiritual doubts. After my wedding, he began crossing the street when he saw me approaching rather than risk having to acknowledge me. Sister Martinez, no relation, despite the shared surname, who had been like a surrogate mother to me after my own mother's death years earlier, stopped speaking to me entirely. She had been one of Sarah's closest friends and had provided tremendous comfort during my grieving process. Now she looked right through me as if I were invisible. The young families I had shepherded, the teenagers I had helped through various crises, the elderly brothers and sisters I had assisted with practical needs, all of them vanished from my life overnight. People who had expressed deep gratitude for my help and guidance now treated me like a dangerous stranger who might contaminate them with apostate thinking. The professional consequences were significant as well. Several business contacts who were also witnesses suddenly became difficult to work with. Projects that had been moving smoothly encountered unexpected obstacles and delays. Referrals that I had counted on for years dried up completely. While nothing was said directly, the message was clear. Choosing Elena over the organization had consequences that extended far beyond the Kingdom Hall. The psychological impact was enormous. For 32 years, my entire identity had been built around being one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I was Elder Martinez, a respected member of the community, someone that younger brothers looked up to and sisters felt comfortable confiding in. I had a clearly defined role, a sense of purpose, and an unshakable understanding of my place in God's cosmic plan. Without that identity, I felt lost in ways I hadn't experienced since adolescence. Who was I if not one of Jehovah's Witnesses? What was my purpose if not serving the organization and advancing kingdom interests? How was I supposed to distinguish right from wrong without the detailed guidelines I had followed for 3 decades? The doctrinal framework that had provided structure and meaning to every aspect of my life was suddenly gone, leaving me adrift in a world that seemed chaotic and purposeless. I had been taught that people outside the organization lived empty, immoral lives without hope or direction. Now I was one of those people, and I didn't know how to navigate this new reality. Elena was incredibly patient and supportive during this difficult transition period. She had grown up in a large, loving family where disagreements were common but relationships remained intact. The concept of completely severing ties with someone because they made different life choices was foreign to her experience and deeply troubling to her sense of basic human decency. Her questions about the shunning practice forced me to examine my former beliefs more critically than I ever had before. Had Jesus really taught his followers to cut off family members who made choices they disagreed with? Did the early Christians really organize themselves with such rigid hierarchical structures and punitive disciplinary measures? Were the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control really evident in an organization that practiced such systematic cruelty? The first year of our marriage was a period of profound internal upheaval. While I was experiencing genuine happiness in my relationship with Elena, I was simultaneously grieving the loss of everything else that had given my life structure and meaning. It felt like living in two parallel universes, one filled with love, warmth, and authentic human connection, and another characterized by emptiness, rejection, and spiritual confusion. Elena suggested that I might benefit from professional counseling, and after several months of resistance, I agreed to see a therapist. Dr. Patricia Williams specialized in helping people navigate major life transitions and had extensive experience working with former members of high-control religious groups. Dr. Williams helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't just normal. It was entirely predictable given the circumstances. "You've essentially lost your entire social world overnight," she explained during one of our early sessions. "It's similar to what refugees experience when they're forced to leave everything familiar behind, except in your case, you weren't escaping persecution. You were punished for refusing to abandon someone you love." Through therapy, I began to recognize the characteristics of what psychologists call undue influence, the systematic methods used by high-control groups to maintain member compliance and discourage independent thinking. The constant warnings about apostate literature and ideas, the discouragement of higher education and critical analysis, the emphasis on organizational loyalty over personal conscience, the punishment of those who asked difficult questions. These weren't signs of divine guidance but of human manipulation and control. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. If the organization wasn't really God's channel of communication with humanity, then I had spent 32 years following the wrong path, making major life decisions based on false premises. If the elders weren't really appointed by Holy Spirit, then I had subjected myself and others to unnecessary control and judgment. If the promised paradise wasn't real, then Sarah was simply gone forever, not sleeping peacefully in anticipation of a resurrection reunion. But gradually, with Dr. Williams' help and Elena's unwavering support, I began to build a new understanding of spirituality, purpose, and meaning that didn't depend on organizational approval or doctrinal certainty. Elena's more personal approach to faith resonated with me in ways the organization's rigid structure never had. She prayed regularly but spontaneously, read the Bible for comfort rather than doctrinal ammunition, and found God in nature, music, acts of kindness, and moments of human connection rather than in meetings, field service reports, and organizational publications. I started attending Elena's Catholic Church occasionally, not because I was converting but because I was curious about different approaches to worship and community building. Father Miguel was nothing like the stern, controlling religious leader I had expected based on witness teachings about false religion. He was warm, thoughtful, intellectually honest, and genuinely interested in helping people grow spiritually rather than manipulating their behavior through guilt and fear. The congregation was refreshingly diverse. People of different ages, educational backgrounds, economic circumstances, and levels of religious commitment who somehow managed to worship together peacefully despite their differences. No one monitored my clothing choices, timed my prayers, evaluated my spiritual progress, or reported my activities to religious authorities. I could simply sit quietly, listen to the homily, participate as much or as little as felt comfortable, and think about spiritual matters without fear of judgment or correction. More importantly, I began developing genuine friendships with Elena's family members and social circle. Her brother Carlos became a close friend with whom I could discuss work challenges, sports, current events, and personal concerns without worrying about whether my comments were sufficiently spiritual or organizationally correct. Her sister Maria and her husband regularly invited us to family gatherings where conversations were natural and spontaneous rather than carefully filtered through religious considerations. These relationships felt fundamentally different from anything I had experienced in the congregation. They were based on mutual affinity and shared interests rather than common doctrine, built on respect for individual differences rather than pressure for conformity, and sustained by unconditional acceptance rather than performance-based approval. When I made mistakes or said something thoughtless, people addressed it directly and moved on rather than viewing it as evidence of spiritual weakness that needed to be reported to religious authorities. 2 years after our wedding, Elena and I made the decision to relocate to a different city. The constant reminders of my former life were making it difficult to fully embrace our new beginning, and Elena had been offered a position with significantly better advancement opportunities at her company's regional headquarters. The move was incredibly healing for both of us. In our new city, I wasn't the former elder who chose worldly love over spiritual responsibility. I was simply David Martinez, a construction project manager married to a wonderful woman named Elena Rodriguez Martinez. We found a house in a friendly neighborhood with mature trees and welcoming neighbors, joined a community garden project that connected us with like-minded people who cared about environmental sustainability, and began building relationships based on who we were in the present rather than what we had left behind in the past. I started volunteering with a local adult literacy program, teaching reading and writing skills to immigrants and adults who had missed educational opportunities earlier in life. The work was deeply fulfilling in ways that field service had never been for me. Instead of trying to convince people to accept a predetermined set of beliefs, I was helping them develop practical skills that would genuinely improve their daily lives and expand their opportunities. Instead of counting hours and tracking placements for organizational reports, I was focused on actual human progress and real-world results. Elena and I also began traveling together, something I had always wanted to do but had never prioritized during my years of constant meeting attendance and organizational commitments. We visited Italy, fulfilling her childhood dream of seeing the village where her grandmother had been born. We explored national parks throughout the western United States, attended concerts and cultural events, and discovered that the world was far more beautiful, diverse, and interesting than the organization had trained me to perceive. The absence of 3 weekly meetings, regular field service, and constant preparation time created space in our lives for hobbies and interests I had abandoned years earlier. I returned to woodworking, a passion for my youth that had been set aside in favor of more spiritual activities. I created custom furniture for our new home, built bookshelves for Elena's extensive collection of novels, and started taking commissions from neighbors and friends who appreciated handcrafted pieces. I also began reading extensively outside of religious literature for the first time in decades. History, science, philosophy, fiction, biography. I rediscovered the joy of learning for its own sake rather than for the purpose of defending predetermined conclusions or preparing for organizational assignments. Elena and I would spend entire weekends reading together, sharing interesting discoveries, and discussing ideas without the constraint of having to reconcile everything with official doctrine. Most significantly, I learned what healthy relationships actually looked like. The conditional love I had experienced in the congregation, affection and acceptance that depended on meeting attendance, field service participation, and doctrinal conformity, was replaced by the unconditional acceptance I found with Elena and her extended family. I didn't have to earn their friendship through spiritual performance or worry about losing their love if I made mistakes, asked difficult questions, or expressed unpopular opinions. This kind of relationship was revolutionary for someone who had spent 32 years walking on eggshells, constantly concerned about whether his thoughts, words, or actions might be viewed as spiritually questionable or potentially dangerous to others' faith. The freedom to be authentically myself, complete with doubts, inconsistencies, and imperfections, was both terrifying and exhilarating. 5 years have now passed since I was expelled from the Jehovah's Witnesses for choosing to marry Elena. During that time, I have built a completely new life based on authentic relationships, personal growth, intellectual honesty, and genuine spiritual exploration rather than organizational compliance and doctrinal certainty. Not a single person from my former congregation has reached out to me during these 5 years. Not during holidays, not on the anniversary of Sarah's death, not when my elderly father passed away last year, not when Elena and I celebrated major milestones in our marriage. The silence has been complete and intentional, a clear message that choosing love over doctrine has permanently severed all connection with the community that once formed the absolute center of my world. The initial loneliness was devastating, but it forced me to develop social and emotional skills I had never needed within the protected environment of the congregation. I learned to form friendships based on common interests and compatible personalities rather than shared religious beliefs. I learned to navigate disagreements and conflicts without viewing them as threats to fundamental truth or challenges to divine authority. I learned to find meaning and purpose through personal contribution and authentic service rather than through institutional compliance and organizational advancement. Elena and I celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary last month with a trip to Spain, another destination from her grandmother's stories about the old country. As I watched Elena's face light up while we explored the narrow streets of Seville and sampled regional cuisine that connected her to her cultural heritage, I felt overwhelming gratitude for the choice I made 5 years ago. Yes, that choice cost me everything I had previously thought mattered. My religious position, my spiritual community, my lifelong identity, my closest friendships. But it gave me something infinitely more valuable. The opportunity to love and be loved authentically, without conditions, reservations, or organizational interference. I think about my former congregation members sometimes, wondering if they're genuinely happy, if they ever question the system that demands such complete loyalty, if they miss the friendship we once shared. I hope they find peace and fulfillment in their chosen path, just as I have found peace and fulfillment in mine. The price I paid for leaving was higher than I ever imagined it could be. When you build your entire adult life around a religious organization, when your identity, relationships, worldview, and daily schedule all revolve around institutional requirements and expectations, extracting yourself means losing virtually everything that has provided structure and meaning to your existence. The shunning policy ensures that this cost is so prohibitively high that most people will never risk it, regardless of how unhappy, doubtful, or spiritually unfulfilled they become. The threat of losing every friend, every social connection, and every support system is enough to keep most members in line even when their hearts and minds are pulling them in different directions. But I also learned that it is possible to rebuild, to start completely over at 53 years old, to create a new life based on different values and priorities than those you were taught to consider non-negotiable. The love I found with Elena wasn't just romantic. It became the catalyst that helped me discover self-acceptance, authentic spirituality, and genuine community for the first time in my adult life. I don't regret my choice, despite everything it cost me. Some prices are worth paying for freedom, truth, and love. When I wake up next to Elena each morning, when I see her smile across the breakfast table as we plan our day together, when we discuss dreams and projects and possibilities for our future, I know with absolute certainty that I made the right decision. The friends who abandoned me for choosing love over organizational loyalty weren't really friends at all. They were fellow participants in a system that prioritized institutional concerns over human relationships, doctrinal purity over compassion, and organizational reputation over individual well-being. Real friends celebrate your happiness, support your choices even when they don't fully understand them, and stand by you during difficult transitions rather than abandoning you when you need them most. I lost everything I thought I needed to be happy and fulfilled, and discovered everything I actually needed to build a meaningful life. Sometimes the most painful losses open doors to possibilities we never knew existed. Sometimes you have to lose the false to discover the authentic, abandon the counterfeit to embrace the genuine, leave the prison to experience true freedom. The irony is not lost on me that an organization claiming to represent divine love showed me less compassion and human kindness than the so-called worldly people I was taught to avoid. Elena's Catholic family, with their supposedly inferior understanding of God's will, demonstrated more Christ-like behavior in accepting and loving me unconditionally than the congregation that claimed to follow Jesus' example most closely. Today, as I write this story, Elena is in the kitchen preparing dinner while listening to music that would have been considered inappropriate during my witness years. The sound of her laughter fills our home with a warmth that no Kingdom Hall ever provided. Tomorrow we'll attend a community fundraiser for the local food bank, working alongside people of various faiths and backgrounds to address real human needs rather than promoting organizational literature. Next month we're planning to visit Elena's cousin in Denver, a trip that would have been impossible during my elder years when every weekend was consumed by meetings, field service, and congregation responsibilities. Next year we hope to take that long-delayed trip to Greece, exploring ancient history and philosophy without the constraint of viewing everything through the lens of watchtower interpretations. I have learned that losing friends who only loved you conditionally makes room for relationships based on genuine affection and mutual respect. I have discovered that questioning deeply held beliefs, rather than leading to spiritual darkness, can actually illuminate truth that was previously hidden by institutional dogma. I have found that choosing personal conscience over organizational compliance, far from resulting in divine punishment, can lead to greater peace and spiritual fulfillment than I ever experienced as a faithful follower. The community I've built with Elena isn't based on shared doctrine or common religious identity. Instead, it's founded on shared values: kindness, honesty, personal growth, service to others, and commitment to treating all people with dignity regardless of their beliefs or background. These relationships are messier and more complex than the sanitized friendships I knew in the congregation, but they're also more authentic and ultimately more satisfying. I still consider myself a spiritual person, but my spirituality is no longer mediated through human organizations or filtered through institutional interpretations. I find God in Elena's compassion for struggling coworkers, in the satisfaction of teaching someone to read their first complete sentence, in the beauty of sunrise over the mountains near our home, in the laughter of children playing in our neighborhood park. This kind of spirituality doesn't require weekly meetings or monthly reports. It doesn't demand that I convince others to accept my particular understanding of divine truth, or that I separate myself from people whose beliefs differ from mine. Instead, it encourages me to live with integrity, treat others with love and respect, and contribute positively to the world around me. The fear that kept me trapped in an unsatisfying situation for so many years, the fear of losing everything if I followed my heart, turned out to be both completely justified and ultimately irrelevant. I did lose everything I thought mattered, but I gained things I never knew were possible. I lost the security of having all my questions answered by organizational publications, but I gained the freedom to think for myself and draw my own conclusions. I lost the comfort of belonging to a group that claimed to have exclusive access to divine truth, but I gained the humility that comes from acknowledging that spiritual matters are complex and mysterious, and that no human institution has a monopoly on understanding God's will. I lost the identity that came from holding a prestigious position in a religious hierarchy, but I gained a sense of self-worth based on my character and actions rather than my titles and responsibilities. I lost friends who loved me only as long as I conformed to their expectations, but I gained relationships based on genuine affection and mutual acceptance. Most importantly, I lost the loneliness and despair that had been consuming me since Sarah's death, and I found love, partnership, and hope for the future that I never expected to experience again. The path from faithful elder to expelled former member wasn't one I chose willingly or traveled easily. Every step involved loss, grief, and uncertainty about whether I was making the right decisions. But looking back now, I can see that each painful transition was also a step toward greater authenticity, deeper relationships, and more genuine spiritual fulfillment. Elena saved my life in ways she'll never fully understand. Not just by loving me, though that was certainly part of it, but by showing me what unconditional acceptance looked like, by asking questions that forced me to examine my beliefs more honestly, by demonstrating that it was possible to live with integrity and purpose without institutional control and approval. She never asked me to leave the organization or criticized my faith during our courtship. She simply loved me as I was, supported me through my struggles, and created space for me to make my own decisions about what kind of life I wanted to build. The fact that I chose her over the congregation wasn't a victory for her. It was a victory for both of us, and for the possibility of authentic love overcoming institutional fear. My name is David Martinez. 5 years ago, I was expelled from Jehovah's Witnesses for marrying the woman who became my partner in building a life based on love rather than doctrine, inclusion rather than exclusion, growth rather than stagnation, and freedom rather than control. I lost every friend I thought I had. I lost the community that had defined my identity for over 3 decades. I lost the certainty that comes from believing you possess absolute truth. I lost the security of having every major decision guided by organizational direction. It was the best decision I ever made. Today I have real friends who love me for who I am rather than what I believe. I have a community that values diversity of thought and respects individual conscience. I have the intellectual freedom to question, explore, and change my mind without fear of punishment. I have the personal autonomy to make choices based on love, compassion, and personal conviction rather than institutional policy. But most of all, I have Elena, my wife, my best friend, my partner in creating a life filled with joy, adventure, growth, and authentic human connection. Every morning when I wake up beside her, every evening when we sit together planning our future, every moment when I see her smile and remember how close I came to letting organizational pressure rob me of this happiness, I am grateful beyond words for the courage to choose love over fear. The cost of that choice was everything I thought I couldn't live without. The reward was everything I never knew I needed. Sometimes you have to lose your whole world to find your real life. Sometimes love is worth everything it costs you. Sometimes the best decision you ever make is the hardest decision you ever have to make. And sometimes, when you choose love over everything else, you discover that love was the only thing that really mattered all along.